welcome back to Among the World, where I share stories and lessons I've learned chasing courage. The last time I left us off, we were headed towards a rock in our camper van in New Zealand. And so I remember we're headed towards this rock, and in my mind, I was thinking, oh my gosh, we're gonna hit the rock, we're gonna hit the rock, there's a rock, there's a rock, there's a rock, there's a rock. And boom! We hit the rock. And like, I couldn't believe we actually hit this rock. Immediately, the first thought that came to my mind was grab all your valuables. What if this thing blows? And so I turn over to my friend. I'm like, grab your passport and your valuables. We gotta get out. What if this thing blows? And so, like, I take my stuff and like I shove open the door, and there's all this tall grass. And I wade through the grass and I stand about like 30 feet away from the van, and I waited there for 5 seconds, but I felt like so long. And I realized my friend wasn't getting out. And so I ran back to the van and I wade through all this grass and I open the door and I look at her. I'm like, you have to get out. What if this thing blows? And she's like over there just like stunned. And she like looks at me with this look of distress, and she goes, I'm trying but I can't. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, like what to do. And finally she gets her seatbelt off and like she pushes open the door, and on that side is actually where it hit the rock. And so the door had this dent in it that kind of forced it to like be difficult to open. And not only that, but the gasoline tank was on that side, which is even scarier. And so finally she manages to wedge the door open, and like we both step like 30 feet away from this van, and we're like, oh shoot, like what to do now? If you've enjoyed my adventures, show me some love and hit that like button. Thank you. My firstborn instincts kick in. Okay, we can do A, B, C. A, we see if we can try to call using our phone. B, we can go over to the camper van site nearby and see if somebody else has service. Or C, we can try to hitchhike. And so first we try to call somebody with our phone, and we didn't have service or something just wasn't going through. So we weren't able to contact anybody. We decided we would go and walk to the other side where people were parked. And we were approaching these people who had just gotten out of their car. We're like, I'm so sorry. We had just gotten in a crash with our camper van, and for some reason our service isn't working. Like, is it okay if we borrow your phone? And thankfully, we ran into some really nice people. Like, they let us use your phone to try to call the police or somebody. But it turned out they didn't have service. So, like, we tried, I think, like two phones, and no one was having service. And so we didn't know what to do. And we're like, at this point, like, those are the only people in sight. And so it probably was that we're in the middle of nowhere, and that's why we weren't having service. So my friend and I decide that we had to probably do plan C. We go to the street and we put up our thumbs and see who is willing to help us. Anyway, so we went to the street, and I'm over here trying to hitchhike. I'm putting my thumb out, and like people are just driving by, and like I'm praying that, like, Lord, like, would you please send us somebody kind who would help us? And it's like people just keep driving by. 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, no one's stopping. And finally, this van slows down and it backs up. And I looked at the van. I'm like, oh shoot, it looks like this van is gonna break down too. Like, it was like a pretty rickety looking van. And they backed up, and this man with dreadlocks, tan skin, and sweatpants got out, and he walked towards us, and he was like, so what happened? We're like, we got in an accident and we hit a rock. And so he went over there by the van to investigate what happened. And he looked at it, and wow, this is a funny man, because this man, he came back. He was like, looks like the rock won. hey, I'm glad that he could find some kind of light, in the situation. But anyways, he goes and he brings out a rope. It was his laundry rope, which was actually the equivalent of about like 3 strands of yarn we like tweeted or tied together. And like my mind, I was like, I don't think that's gonna work. But like he has a good heart, so I'm just gonna let him do it. So he takes this rope, but really laundry twine, and he goes and he ties it to the back of our car and ties it to the back of his car. And then he goes and gets in, steps on the gas. He steps on gas, and the van goes. The rope breaks. And we're like, oh shit. Like in my mind, I'm like, yeah, like I already had an idea that happened, but like now he doesn't have a laundry rope anymore either. And so he comes back out and he says to us, he's like, looks like it must have been a bad rope. Yes. So then he asks me, he's like, so do you guys have a rope? And I went into the van and I went into my suitcase. Thankfully, I had like a paracord rope, and so I brought that back for him, and he strapped it onto the back of our van and the back of his van. And all the while that he's doing this, his girlfriend comes out, and she was really sweet. Like she tried to offer us her phone and see if we can contact somebody, but it also turned out that they too did not have service because we later found out that where we were was in the middle of nowhere. And the closest town anywhere near in sight would be at least an hour away. And so, as you can imagine, my friend and I are like pretty stressed and pretty desperate here. And he tried to pull the van out, but like the rope was strong enough this time, thankfully. But so was the van, and the van wouldn't budge, and we couldn't put it in neutral because the way that the van had hit this rock, the impact we later found out was so bad that the steering column was snapped. So, yeah, he couldn't pull out the van. And him and his girlfriend, they're like, well, if you guys trust us, you can ride in the back of our van and go with us into town. My friend and I looked at each other and we're like, so we're going to talk about this. Is it okay if we like talk about this first and see like what is the best course of action for us? So they were like, okay, like that's fine. So my friend and I stepped like, 10 or 20 feet away and we're like, oh my gosh, like what should we do?
People weren't stopping for us to help us, and these are the only people who stopped to help us. But like, we don't know them, and like, is this safe? Like, what if we like get kidnapped or something crazy happens? But like, what are we supposed to do? And like, we weren't having service to call anybody. Like we're really desperate at this point. Nobody was stopping, so what do we do? And
After some going back and forth about this, like we had decided that we would go with them, and if something goes south, we would jump out of the van, which is pretty crazy. So we go to their van and they open the door and we saw that they had a bed back there. So we pretty much just sat on their bed, and then I made sure to watch how they closed the door in case there was some kind of child safety lock feature. And so I watched how they closed the door, and then we started driving. I'm like, oh my gosh, like what have we signed ourselves up for? And so it was in that moment when I was thinking about how to unlock the door, the possibility of jumping out this van, that it occurred to me, oh my goodness, we don't even know these people's names. My friend must have been thinking the same thing because in that moment she turned to them and she was like, so what are your names? Like, we didn't even get to introduce ourselves. And so they shared with us their names and stuff. And then, like, my friend sent a text to her brother in case if this phone should ever see service. And maybe her brother or somebody will know where we are. And so she sends them a text. And then we were talking to this couple and got their names and stuff. In my mind, I'm just thinking, like, oh, shoot, like, if something goes down south, like, what are we going to do? And, like, the whole New Zealand trip was just flashing before my eyes. And I'm like, oh my goodness, we came here and we're so naive, fantasizing about this trip in New Zealand. And all we could think about was the Shire and the camper van. And this is not what we imagined. Like, if something happened, like, how are our parents and our family members supposed to know? Are we going to be those travelers who show up on the New Zealand news that go missing, And like, oh, it's just so what to do. And at this point, we had already almost ran out of gas in the middle of nowhere. And then during an 8-hour hike, I rolled my ankle twice. And then after that, we missed our accommodation because there was a cutoff time during which you had to arrive at the reservation. And now we crashed our camper van. So, what's so bad about jumping out of a moving van?